righty. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening event. Left Bank Books is so excited to present 2020 National Poetry Series winners Teresa K. Miller and Devin Walker Figueroa. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters for their outpouring of love for our bookstore, especially over this past year. We are open to the public and preparing for the holiday season, so you can come into our store to find these beautiful books on our shelves, pick them up curbside, or ship them anywhere in the world. Remember to shop early and shop local this season. We are happy to be able to bring our events to you in this virtual format. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and allow space for new thoughts and conversations to make the world a better place. We hope you enjoy this event, and we hope you support Left Bank Books and the poets featured this evening by purchasing copies for you and all of your friends at left-bank.com. Ordering from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and our staff operating, and we continue to be amazed and so grateful for your support, particularly throughout the pandemic. I am Emiliana, a bookseller and the social media manager for Left Bank Books. I'm here this evening helping to produce one of our hundreds of authors events that we host each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis, which typically includes Shane, the wonderful event host I'm sure you're all very familiar with. We will be taking questions from the audience, so please be sure to type your questions in the comments, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and YouTube to be notified of all of our virtual events. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Teresa K. Miller and Devin Walker Figueroa. Teresa K. Miller won the 2020 National Poetry Series with Borderline Fortune, having previously placed as a finalist with 2 other manuscripts. A graduate of Barnard College and the Mills College MFA program, she's the author of Sped and Forever No Low, as well as the co-editor of Food First, Selected Writings from 40 Years of Movement Building. Her poems and essays have appeared in Alternate, Entropy, Diagram, Common Dreams, Empty Mirror, and elsewhere. Originally from Seattle, she spent 3 years as a writer-in-residence at San Francisco's Sanchez Grotto Annex, and now tends a mini orchard near Portland, Oregon. Devin Walker Figueroa is the author of Philomath, selected for the 2020 National Poetry Series by Sally Keith. Originally from Kings Valley, a ghost town in the Oregon Coast Range, she is the graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the 2018 recipient of the New England Review's Emerging Writer Award. Her poems have appeared in such publications as The Nation, Poetry, the American Poetry Review, Lana Turner, and Plowshares. And now I would like to welcome our guests for the evening, Teresa K. Miller and Devin Walker Figueroa. Wherever you are in the world, give them a little round of applause to give them a hearty welcome into our event this evening. Hello to both of you.
Hi, Emiliana. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thanks to Devin for being here. Thanks to Left Bank for hosting us. I'm just super excited and grateful to be here tonight. Just to be super honest, it's slightly a strange format. We're sort of talking into the abyss, so we don't know who's here watching, but I think I speak for both of us when I say we're grateful if you're watching live, and if you catch it later, thank you for doing that. And I'm just super excited to be in conversation with Devin about Philomath because it's a gorgeous book, and we have very different writing styles and very different backgrounds, and yet there's so much about the books that seems to be in conversation. So we didn't script out what we're going to say tonight, but we did pick a couple of selections that we thought might pique people's interest and kind of give you a taste of what our work is all about. And we're just going to see where the conversation goes, and you can help shape that as well through the Q&A at the end. So thanks again so much.
And I wanted to thank everyone too for being here, and it's such a great chance to read with you, Teresa. I've been looking forward to this so much, and thank you, Emiliana and Left Bank Books. One really cool thing too about ordering through Left Bank is you can get signed copies of our books because they did this really cool thing where we send in book plates. So just another reason to order this incredible book through, there we go. through Left Bank. So it's a real honor. Should I start reading?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right. So I'm gonna read a poem that's based off of an experience I had attending Chemeketa Community College in Oregon. It was a bronze casting class. And it's called Beginning Wax to Bronze at Chemeketa Community College. I began applying the Vaseline, prepping my pig heart for the months-long transition from flesh to air to wax to air to bronze. I want the closest thing to human I can find, and this is it. And I can honestly say I got it for free from Mount Angel Meat Company. Before immersing the muscle in what dentists use to capture impressions, I put my fingers inside and widen the chambers. Make sure they're big enough to hold a handful of pencils or fresh-cut orchids. Our teacher, Calvin, tells me I could make good money selling these at Saturday market, but I've no desire to share my early attempts. Sometimes I think I'm pro-eugenics, my friend Susan whispers, her eyes fixed on our pregnant classmate who's seated in the corner, naked from the waist up, slathering her breasts and belly in plaster of Paris. I mean, who gets their boobs inked with barbed wire and flaming dice? Maybe she's religious, the guy next to us suggests as he eases his pin tool along the surface of a tiny Victory brown wax gladiator whose chest plate, he assures us, is completely accurate. Don't misunderstand me, Susan goes on. I know my parents should have been sterilized from the get-go. She's sculpting a hollow prairie dog that once done will double as an urn and wait 8 months for her father's ticker to quit. Calvin's decorated our classroom with classical art. He's torn from a 14-month calendar that began in 1987, the year of the rabbit and my birth, meaning Venus de Milo's mutilated perfection flickers on a yellow sheet under the thrum of the ventilation fan lately installed to keep our lungs free from glass and early decline. We sometimes enter a trance, every eye fixed on a shape it's anxious to see made void. I want my corpse to be a puppet, Susan once told me. That way you can be the voice reading my funeral message going something like, take a look at my life, I'm a lot like you. I nodded, said I'd love to be her voice and have always hoped for the chance to be a master of some kind. Calvin's brought us a book on bronze through the ages, and it's making the rounds. The boy who's forming a bong, even though he knows it's not allowed and pretty toxic to inhale anything from heated bronze, says, skip me, meaning I get extra time to linger over a 12th century she-wolf. Entrapment or decay, I inquire, pointing to her gaping leg, a kind of absence she seems shaped around, because I want to know if the artist fucked up, or if this is what happens in time to everything we cast, and the teacher supposes the maker didn't vent the joint right, as in perfectly, and this should be a lesson to us all. On his neck, what Hippocrates once called a witch's teat oozes, and I consider how something so minor can kill a person if ignored. Get yourself looked at, I want to say, but don't. More evidence I'm not the person I should be. Calvin's asked me to model for him. He's being commissioned by some rich guy in Oahu to sculpt a female nude surrounded by blown glass flames rising up around her and illuminated blue from below her marble pedestal. I could be her. She could have my face, small breasts, and scoliotic spine, or some version thereof. But I keep this information to myself, confidential. I'm getting dirty looks for my pregnant classmate who's sniffing the air in dramatic fashion, hoping I'll reassure everyone that my reeking undertaking will subside soon enough. But in truth, it's barely begun. The book states the she-wolf was cast centuries before the murderous babies were placed below her swollen teats. Trials and executions at the wolf were recorded up until 1438, meaning the she-wolf has seen more death than you and I will ever, meaning healing might always take place behind closed doors while its counterpart requires a public square be filled with symphonies of human gasps. Susan smiles at me. Like most people I know, she lacks health and dental. Her left eye tooth is gray, evidence of a failing nerve. When she gets down about her dimming grin, I remind her my wisdoms have sunk so low in my face that I'll start losing sensation in the near future. This seems to help her see me as her people. I bought you guys protection, Calvin announces, tossing a handful of paper surgical masks onto the table. Susan sighs, leans over, and says, "What a joke. We'll all get cancer in 5 years with those face diapers. The mold around my heart is setting so slowly I'll have to leave it overnight." I pick up one of the masks, flimsy as an intimate, and try it on, find myself back at Good Samaritan's emergency room, knowing my mother's lungs are filling with the contents of her ruptured heart. No, aorta. It starts with a tear in the tunica intima, that thin robe dressing a vein from within. She doesn't know I'm here. She'll never know again. The doctors ask permission to revive her with something chemical and new. I say yes. I say yes. I take the mask off, knowing how right Susan is. We're all going to suffocate down here, I say. And Susan smiles, and I glimpse her dying tooth, and she asks, "Did you know Vikings strangled the slave girls of important dead men?" as she digs a loop tool into her wax. The animal's joints are thick and lack adequate vents, meaning entrapment will occur, meaning some part of her creation won't materialize under the crucible's tilted lip. They'd get all plastered, she continues, and fuck the girls and shout out to their gone master some version of "This is for you." No, I say. No, history's never been my strong suit. When the pregnant student realizes she's forgotten the Vaseline, she screams because she can't pull the shell away without the sensation of tearing a giant Band-Aid off. The whole class, ordering her to breathe, assumes she's gone into early labor. And who knew all those nearly invisible hairs covering our hides had such strength? I wonder when it began, the belief that the part of us that's always been dead keeps growing after what we call life has left the room.
Oh, so good. Yeah, I'm really tempted to dive in and start talking, but I'll read my pairing first, and then we'll start talking. So my book, as I mentioned, is quite different from Devin's formally. The poems are very short, and they're also untitled. So just to give some context as a point of entry into the work, since what I'll be reading isn't quite as self-contained, I've been thinking about the book like a braid, and the 3 strands would be the intrapersonal, so within the psyche, the interpersonal, particularly within families, and then the ecological. And I'm specifically really interested in the illusion of separation. So memories fighting against each other, the way that families fracture, particularly in the face of denial, which is a consequence often of untreated mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and then ecologically, the illusion of separation of humans from the ecosystem, which has brought all manner of crises to our door, particularly in the past year. So I'll read a few selections from the book, and it certainly doesn't go in an arc with a tidy resolution, but there is, I hope, in the course of the work, transformation. So the 4 titled sections of the book are Of the Dead. We kind of start in the muck, and then Our Own Worst Consequence, Disenthrall, so the spell begins to break about halfway through, and finally, Lay Down Your Rigid Creation. Past whittling the moment, we go underground, the dead murmuring in memory. Once the canyons were born. Once every river had a first day to flow. Once I rose a blank sandstone canvas, and you scratched your name in my side. The same road awaited. Someday came to set out walking. A whirling turnkey toy in the night circus, one Polaroid replacing the hours no man or child would save you. Your weather came to waste you. How I yearned to claim a new ecosystem, that dry stand of beetle kill pine. From the corpse-sized pillar, Noguchi called forth rings of a worm, strikes like sticks of dynamite. How far the gale carried us to get tangled in our own string. A whole continent, a separate ocean. In Queens, I am a stone, carved to let water run down. My heart has stopped. The stones envy my stillness. Lured back, I spun myself a shiny aluminum wing. But in the afternoon, she put on a new face. Those you love will evaporate before you. Leave their slack-jawed, wind-up bodies lying in the yard. Nicotine-stained filters reeking in the kitchen garbage. Here is the next moment of your life. You spent it in my crooked song. Staggered down the shivering fossil seep, an ancient unearthed stream murky with our skin and sweat. What withered life, I worry inside me. A Frankenstein montage. The dinosaur halfway to flight, claws against intercostals, tapping on ribs. Too late, too late, too late. The branches sang me silent. Papery maple skittered on the window. Cutting too hard, too fast, spurs a reaction in kind. My creator topped them all. 30 winters thrust through summer. I clenched my swallowed octaves. You twirled me a crackling helicopter, chased me a birch twig broom. It wasn't all bad, was it? Didn't we, in the slant light, have fun? So we thought we might talk a little bit about, well, a lot of things. We'll see where it goes. But one of the things that we were kind of texting back and forth about was the influence of other art forms in our work. Your piece is more kind of traditionally ekphrastic, although maybe traditionally is the wrong word, because one of the things I love about your book is that it takes something that seems straightforward on the surface and subverts it, and then subverts it again and again. I mean, even just hearing you read that piece now, I thought, oh, I hadn't thought of that connection before, and I've already read it quite a few times. So my piece about Noguchi is maybe the most traditionally ekphrastic as well. You know, it's talking about, sure, but I know you and I also both have a music background and you have a dance background, and I'm curious about kind of how all those, you know, different media have influenced your work and that piece in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I also just want to thank you for that beautiful reading. I also was hearing new things. I've read the book several times at this point, but just like hearing it in your voice brings out new notes for me as well. Um, on the just to speak very quickly, I guess about art's influence on the book more broadly. I want to come back to Noguchi and art's influence on your book too, because I get this sense like reading your book just like more broadly, not just the sections you read too, although you have bits and pieces of this in there too. There's a real interest in the act of creation and kind of like being both within and outside of that and examining it. So I want to come back to that too. But as far as art, yeah. So I would say like one of the biggest influences that particularly dance and music actually had on the collection was the spacing of some of the more maybe they look a little weirdly spaced. Let me see if I can find one here. These kind of like more scattershot pieces that have like there we go, like all those spaces in there, because I think in like music notation, I think of like the Séjouré kind of like music notation, like you have a quarter rest or a half rest or a whole rest, and you can kind of modulate how quickly someone is reading or how long they're lingering in a pause by how large that space is. So it's sort of movement as a unit of silence and pause. So I feel like that's kind of like dance music stuff going on there, like, oh, I'm trying to choreograph how the eye is moving over the page, but it's also in these sort of musical units. And then like the sculpture bit, like that comes in more content wise, I suppose, and then gets spun out a little bit like in terms of metaphor in that poem. But yeah, I would love to ask about the role of art in your work too, and also just this kind of question of the act of creation as well. One thing that really interested me about the fact that you included Noguchi specifically is I think about some of his sculpture where the line between what nature has made, like what's natural and what's artificial, is somewhat blurred, right? Because you'll have a piece of stone that's been eroded in a very particular way, and he'll preserve that, but then he'll also add his human erosion element. And it kind of blurs this line too between human time and geologic time, which I think is also something you really beautifully do in your collection. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk just like in an open way, like about, this is very open-ended, about like art's influence on the book, but also just that creation aspect and nature and artifice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I said, I think my book doesn't deal as directly with art as far as, you know, commentary on existing pieces of art in the way that yours does very beautifully multiple times in the collection. But I am interested in that idea of human manipulation of the landscape and how that can go well or badly for us and for the ecosystem. So this idea of, you know, a person becoming a canyon and having someone else's name scratched in their side, and that's a manipulation. And I, you know, specifically thinking about in the Southwest and some of the destruction that humans have wrought, you know, for instance, flooding Glen Canyon, you know, and the dam causing just this huge loss of artifact and history, but also the way that families obviously scratch their names in our sides, some of them more than others, maybe some of them more lovingly, you know, write their names on us, and some of us get gouged. I think that's something between the two of our books we have in common, even though we're coming from very different backgrounds. The mark of family, and we also talked a little bit about the fact that we've both unfortunately lost parents early, and that continues to haunt the book. So when you ask about creator, I mean, that's something that I'm thinking about as well on multiple levels. I also noticed that we have religion as a thread and reaction against religion as a thread in the book, and in the poems in particular that we've read. So thinking about creator as like parents, but also cosmically, religiously, spiritually. And I think those two are distinct. That's all interesting to me. And in your piece in particular, I know, having read an article or an interview in the Portland Mercury, you said you used pseudonyms, and the choice, I'm not sure if this is a pseudonym or not, but that the teacher's name is Calvin. And so then it evokes this idea of Calvinism, of predestination, of, it doesn't really matter what good works we do in our life. Our destinies are set. There may be a God but we can't persuade this God, for instance, to release us from a decaying town, in the case of your poem, from teeth literally decaying out of the mouth. So that sort of leads me to be curious about religion, because I think we're both pushing back against it in a way, but it seems like, you're a speaker, and I'm assuming you were more immersed in it in a way that I was a little bit on the outside of religion, and more just kind of having it from a very superstitious grandmother, as opposed to having it in my daily life. So
yeah, certainly as a concept, it comes up in your book, this idea, like God I think like the word God comes up like at least 4 or 5 times in the course of the book. So yeah, I definitely was feeling that connection. And as you mentioned too, talking about creation, and this kind of in connection with gods and humans and parents specifically, right? They're kind of like our first gods or whatever. They, we come into the world thinking they can do anything. But like this, the flooding, right? Like that sometimes the creation is a creation of disaster. Like we talk about creation of art, but like sometimes that's really violent. The creation's very violent sometimes in the context of these environments that you're bringing in your book, which also brings me to ask about the relationship between landscape and body in Borderline Fortune, because you were talking about too, kind of like being, having the sense of like being the canyon. There's also, we see all of these different landscapes, and some of them seem to kind of operate as an objective correlative. Like there's the Bering Strait, kind of this very remote, removed, as a reader, I come to that and I see like distances, and ice, and there are these landscapes that become at once like vast and almost like agoraphobia inducing, but also like deeply tied to interiority. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection between just like your treatment of like landscape and environment in the book, which was really moving to me as I went through. I felt taken through numerous landscapes, both interiority wise and in the external world.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Coming from you, that's a big compliment, because you've also really captured landscape in your book. That's a piece that's resonant between the two. But as I was thinking about those 3 strands that I mentioned in the beginning, the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, the ecological, my point of entry was really the ice. So I also grew up in the Pacific Northwest, but in Washington, where the land is actually incrementally rebounding from the last ice age still. So, a lot of places relative to sea level, sea level is rising. In the Pacific Northwest, the land is still rebounding. And in thinking about ice, then I started thinking about my great-grandfather, one of my great-grandfathers on my father's side, because as I mentioned, the early loss of a parent, my father was killed when I was 23. And he had been this relentless genealogist because he also lost his mother too young to cancer. And so there's this sense of ancestry accumulating and bearing down. And as I was thinking about my great-grandfather, he had been a government school teacher on Ingeluk, which is Little Diomede Island in the Bering Strait. And at that time in 1907 to 1909, the ice would completely freeze over in the winter, and people would actually walk to Wales, Alaska to pick up the mail. They'd walk on the ice to go hunting. And now the last time that there's been a full ice was 2012. So in just over 100 years, the landscape has completely changed. And that idea, that you brought up around wreaking tragedy on the planet, the destruction as opposed to artistic creation. I mean, that's something that was unintentional, but that was also very much human caused. So that's kind of how I was thinking about landscape. And then, of course, he was living in this hut of the ship that had the wood to build his cabin actually blew away in a gale. And so they basically just had to scrounge. He and his Inupiat co-teacher, who was also his translator, just basically had to make themselves a little hut and live in it until they could get supplies. The ice thawed. So that definitely plays a part in the book. But on that idea about landscape and kind of those resonances, maybe this is a good time for you to read Gallowed Bee, because I feel like that hugely evokes both landscape and this idea of creator and this, faith theme that maybe we could return to. And also somehow I want to talk about line breaks a little bit before we go. So
Sure. I'll just say really quickly, the connection between like genealogy and like kind of like geology is like so fascinating here. It's almost like there are like layers of strata in the book. and just like, even you seem to have a very in-depth knowledge of geology that you bring to the book. Like I just have to ask, like, where does that come from? Is that like is that something you studied in school, or that you independently just like took an interest in? And then I promise I'll move on and read.
Well, I feel like I would be a poser if I claimed too much knowledge of geology, especially thinking of, we were off camera talking about Forrest Gander, who actually, did study geology outright. But I wasn't an English major. So I was sort of an American history, but really American studies major. And then I had started out as an environmental science major and flipped it to a minor. So working on a lot of like environmental data analysis. And then I also grew up with a mother who got the roadside geology guide to every state that we ever drove through. So between the environmental science and then just living with someone who is obsessed with rocks, that's probably where a lot of it comes from. But we also, as you know, in this part of the country, geology feels very inescapable, right? We have these giant mountains and, just exposed rock, and you're very conscious of where the tectonic plates are and what's going on, I feel like, in this part of the world. So
yeah, it's very active. You are very aware of it. Yeah. Especially in Washington.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. I will go ahead and read Gallowed Bee. And this is the last poem in the collection. Gallowed Bee. The nearest landfill's nowhere near, and no one is to blame. We burn the year's news in the meadow in the mind, till the crosswords and the funnies wilt to winter kill. I trace the day an epitaph in ash. Hallowed be thy games. Every story is ashamed to be true. My father's now a widower, and no one is to blame. My sister doesn't laugh, plots to live on land turned tame, where the soil's kissed with concrete, yields no wine. It's all the same to me if we winnow. If we win, I tell myself the story that I'll visit. Distant cisterns, let their sallow walls win me over, lift my low life and lowly frame of mind. My father gets fined for burning out of season, says he doesn't get why. So the days go slow and I climb a pulsing fence that stops. No bucks nor does observe the neighbors' piglets wallow in their loam. Still, the world is wide if the hymnals hold true, and every beast has a mind to get loose from a valley fallowing toward fell. My sister braids my waist-length mane, says this place is lame. I try to tell her no one is to blame, but the sky is so hollow it swallows every name. Thank you, and we'll pass it to Teresa.
Oh, that poem wrecks me. We'll talk about it, but oh my goodness. Okay. So I guess I already kind of prefaced these ones in talking about my great-grandfather's experience. And then having grown up in Washington, and I'm actually on my mother's side, the fourth generation of my family to live in West Seattle in particular. And West Seattle, the peninsula, is formed by the Duwamish River, named after the Duwamish people, and it's also a working river, so a lot of industry going up and down that channel. Great-grandfather I never knew. Your son-in-law born on Skokomish land I still cross, city to the razored oyster beds. Everywhere we've gone to plant our history, the lichen follows. Crab pot hauling up a giant octopus. Quonset hut surfing the permafrost, where my father's little hands could not will a single watermelon to grow. No chance you'd guess how it would subside, how your sudden exit will shackle us to rebirth. After hate, lies twine into granite, brine into mineral creatures made of lace. On the other side of ice, invention. Your ulu, reindeer fur, and walrus stomach traded for a crisp apron. I went on a growing up adventure too, into the hearts of children, where I fear I'm lodged, all shrapnel and good intention. If I had a child, she was already mine. We did it backward, skipping time. The mouth of the Duwamish smells like creosote, gravel yard, freight train on a rusted trestle. We lashed a raft together and set off paddling. I wasn't yet born. The water dried salty, reliable, cold. Dregs cast, camper top torn and bent in the shadow, the continent's highest peak, towns of circling corvids, junctions, ghosts. How will I learn your chaos? Never sprang from me, wasn't mine, this pile of pointless rubble. And this last poem is the only one that includes quoted text. And the first line and one other line actually come from a letter written by my great-grandmother, who was accompanying her husband for his second year teaching in the Bering Strait. And they took a ship from Seattle up to Alaska, which was a long trip. About 40 miles from Nome, we encountered the ice. The woman who loved God could question. He brought her to the island, not, in fact, beatified. Pieces from 50 to 100 feet long above water. Might drink her away, his son's, his daughter's son. The names untangle something in the cells as they tug. Saint Michael, Point Hope. So trying to remember all the things we were going to talk about, ghosts and line breaks and
Yes, absolutely. I just hearing that one of my favorite lines is that the names untangle something in the cells they tug. St. Michael, Point Hope. I wanted to ask you about kind of the role of naming in the collection. I mean, you talked earlier about this wonderful kind of braided structure, the interpersonal, intrapersonal, and the ecological. And it seems like that metaphor of sort of braiding and entanglement comes in to play with language very much too. And you use different kinds of sources for your diction and your register too. There's the sort of like the scientific and the sort of and then there's like the more kind of the geographical, and there are all these kind of different sources that you're pulling from and weaving those together too. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tangle of names, or the kind of naming in the collection too, because we both have that element of preoccupation in both of our collections, I noticed too.
Yes, yeah, swallows every name. Yeah, so the first line of the book is, "I came here to conjure you." And when I wrote that poem, I thought I was the conjurer. And I think I am one of the conjurers. In both of our books too, yours, like I said, it subverts the surface impression. So the surface impression is, oh, it's very autobiographical and you're the I, you're the speaker. And then there are all of these yous. But then in the way that you've used line breaks, the I and the you become more slippery. And I think in my book, it's very slippery. And so I am often not the speaker. Sometimes the speaker is the landscape, sometimes an ancestor, sometimes someone in the future, sometimes something more cosmic or more cellular. But I thought that I was the conjurer. And then as I started talking about the book, since it's come out, I realized how many other conjurers there are. One of them was my maternal grandmother. So I brought up the religious influence and, how, for me, oppressive that was, because I was never baptized. My father thought that it should be up to me when I reached an age where I could decide. And I never decided to. And so even from the time I was a little kid, my grandma would sit me down and say, you better convince your parents to get you baptized or you'll never see me in heaven. So there was that was kind of the role of religion for me. And one of the reasons why, Gallowed is just an effing gorgeous poem to just on its own, but also the only prayer that I know by heart is the Lord's Prayer, because I was raised as a creaster, right? We went to Christmas and Easter to appease my grandma, and that was it.
Praise.
Oh yeah. So yeah, the people who just show up and the rest of the congregation doesn't recognize them except on the holidays. So that's like the only prayer that I knew. So she was also one of the conjurers. Even though she was very religious, she was also very superstitious, and she read tea leaves and she put curses on people. And it's still, she's been dead for 20 years and still, my mother and I both, particularly my mother, are still very influenced by this kind of spell that she cast. And one of the things that the book is doing is trying to break that spell. And then in talking about it, I realized my father was a conjurer too, even though he was this very rational mathematician, and he wouldn't have said that's what he was doing. But when his mother died early, that's when he got obsessed with genealogy. And so he started collecting names until by the time he got killed, he had assembled more than 30,000. This isn't just like a little family tree you tack up on your door, 30,000 names in his database. He became a hub that around the world would call and email and send us manuscripts, and all of these people who are related to me in some way. So he went on both sides. He filled out his whole side and then my mom's whole side. And so they're all of these ancestors, and it's all down onto the head of a pin, right? Because I'm the only child of an only child of an only child, and I have no children. So this idea of ancestry and naming feels particularly potent and heavy for me. But I'd love to hear you talk about naming as well, and just the music of the Lord's Prayer through this poem that you make completely your own. It's not in any way mimicking it, and yet it's so present. And I think also, just to put out, because we were going to talk a little bit about line breaks, but I don't know if I've ever encountered a more perfect first line. You can read it so many different ways. The nearest land fills nowhere near, and no one is to blame. So literally, there's not a landfill nearby, so you need to burn your garbage on your land. But also, you've been thrown, or the speaker has been thrown into this kind of purgatory with the loss of the mother, no one is near. I mean, it's just, there's so many different ways I could slice it. And I just love to hear you talk about that music and those ideas.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm also really glad I asked about names because that is incredible. 30,000 names. Like that's at that point, that's like this huge like map of people. I mean, these are people like presumably all over the place, right? So it's like you have this sort of map that's connected to you too. And I think about like geography and all of that and how that kind of like ties in. And the metaphor of like conjuring, or just like that, the idea of conjuring is so powerful too, that just to like say these names is to in a way like invoke these people, right? And the places that they're from. There's one point in the book where, and I forget which one it is, where you're kind of talking about like I think like bodies of water joining, or like a river joining. There's some kind of confluence going on, and it makes me think about like you're talking about being like potentially the end of the line, right? And there are like all of these like tributaries kind of flowing into this one channel, and like that's you. It's amazing. Wow.
It's also terrifying.
yeah. I'm sure it's some pressure down. So the music sense, I mean, I often initially write in form, like I'll, like this, I think was initially a villanelle, and then I totally relineated and I took a bunch of stuff out and I changed lines, and there are other poems that were originally terza rima or ottava rima, or canzone. Well, the canzone stayed the same, but those kind of got metabolized into the poem. And then I also was thinking about like, well, you know, I'm addicted to enjambment, as you might have noticed. And so like a kind of heavy style of enjambment. And so if there's an opportunity to create a pause in which like a kind of fruitful misunderstanding, or also just like an understanding, a different reading of the poem could come in, I'm very opportunistic that way. Like I'll try to use it. So I'm like, oh, you know, that's interesting. If you have a pause there, someone's going to assume. But then also like those little lines within the line are, I'm going to use a phrase of Lucy Brock-Broido. You have a really great epigraph of hers in here, which is like the line as a unit of experience, as a kind of like discrete experience, and to think about even a line, even a section of a line when you're working with like Segere, like the spaces, right? Like can be a discrete unit of experience. And like, I don't always get that with every poem, but that's often what I might be striving for. And I notice you have some absolutely stunning enjambment work in your collection as well. And of course, I noticed that you have this great, I was cowering at the circumference of your heart howling, this quote from Lucy Brock-Broido from Bodhisattva, right? And I was just thinking too, like that kind of opportunistic like enjambment too, she does that a lot. She has a very tensile sense of line. So it might be a good place to like segue into talking about like, who are some of your influences? And when you're thinking about like conjuring too, I mean, I think, and you were talking about the blurring between the I and the you, like I think of her master letters, and the you is the podium. Maybe sometimes it's God, maybe sometimes it's a lover or an enemy or a friend, and maybe it's herself, and that you can be that protean, and that kind of slippage can be so fruitful. I definitely kind of like sense some influence there, but like maybe you could talk just more broadly, just kind of about some of the poets who really like moved you to write poetry, and who maybe specifically influenced you as you were writing this book too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Lucy Brock-Broido was huge. Did you study with her? Is that?
I didn't. I had the good fortune of getting to meet her. She stayed and she visited for a few days at Bennington while I was there. But my husband is a protege of hers and studied with her, and so I got to read through all of her massive readers that she put together.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I saw her read once in person. I went to Barnard College which is the Women's College of Columbia. So she was across the street until she passed away. But I went to a reading with Lucy Brock-Brodo and C.D. Wright when I was either, a freshman or a sophomore in college. I know, and both of them, may they rest in peace, because they're both just amazing poets. But yeah, I remember sitting there, and I think she read from the master letters, and I went out and immediately bought it and just became obsessed. So you talked about metabolizing, and I'm sure that has, worked its way through my system and into my work. But I would say earlier influences are E.E. Cummings, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I discovered Lucille Clifton when I was like a freshman in high school, and the spareness of her work. Like, I don't think I write really like any of those poets, but there are elements that stuck with me. And in Lucille Clifton's case, the spareness of her work and the fact that it's so personal. But even she, will switch around to different perspectives. And even though a lot of her work is pretty autobiographical. So yeah, those are some of my influences. Hear some of yours, and then maybe the audience has some questions as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you definitely share her facility for metaphor too.
Thank you.
And this kind of like compaction, like your poems are so like when I read them, I feel like if anything were taken away, it would diminish the poem. Somehow they feel so perfectly edited too. That there's a way in which like, oh, this is the condition under which like a diamond is created. I feel like Lucille Clifton had that too. That's a shared quality. Influences, well, definitely Lucy and C.D. Wright, who also actually came to visit the same year as Lucy at Bennington too, and they would like stay for a few days, give a lecture, give like a kind of craft conversation, give a reading sort of thing. So we met them, but didn't, necessarily get to know them. Mm-hmm. And I just like fell in love with Rising, Falling, Hovering was the first book of C.D. Wright's that I really became kind of obsessed with. And then from there, found, Deep Step Shining and all these other incredible books that she'd written. And that probably also influenced some of the treatment of space too, in Philomath. Jory Graham, definitely like her use of image as a sort of way to transport one in time and space. Those like big associative leaps that she takes and sort of, what do I want to call them? Like epiphanic sojourns. Those that were really influential to me too, especially her work like in Erosion and the End of Beauty around that point. And Sea Change too in Place actually as well. So yeah, I guess we should probably open it up.
Yeah, maybe so.
Jump back in. I don't even want to interrupt because I feel like there's so much ground to cover. And this has just been a wonderful conversation. It's been wonderful to hear you both read and to hear you talk about those sort of like connections that are popping out through the poems that you're reading between both of your collections. And I have a question that maybe we can end on, and it's sort of a big one, but I feel like it's encompassing everything that you've been talking about. And Teresa, you had mentioned the illusion of separation was something that stuck with me. I'm thinking about memory and history and writing those things, and we sort of sometimes conceptualize those as things that are separate from us, like this thing that happened or this person or this place. And Joy Harjo has this poem where she's writing about a person in a rocking chair, and in an essay about the poem she essentially admits or puts to words that she doesn't truly remember who was in the rocking chair, and so that she as the poet, when writing this memory, is sort of, you guys had mentioned earlier, the creator, the one who's shaping the memory, and that idea that every time we return to something, we're transforming it just by the act of returning to it and by the act of writing of it. So I'd love to hear a little bit from both of you. What are like the implications of being the memory or the history writer the person that's putting to words these things that are inherently going to be transformed by your putting them to words. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I mean, it does feel like a responsibility, right? I have to say it's not necessarily one I felt the pressure of when I was initially writing this book, partly because it's my first book. And I was writing some of these poems not with the sense that others would read them, which is a kind of liberating privacy to write within. But then later coming back to them and thinking, oh, like maybe that, the way that the other people involved in my memories, right? The way it might impact them, or the way that they might see things differently than I did. And of course I thought about that, but more towards the end, and once poems started getting published or picked up places, because even once I started sending out, I didn't necessarily think that they would get picked up. But once poems started getting published, I really did start to think about that more. And I actually edited some things and changed some things with that knowledge, though trying to preserve the original impulse too, and kind of sense an urgency of the poem. Teresa, you probably have a better answer than
I don't know about better. I think that was a good answer. I think we're just, because our styles are a little bit different. For me, there aren't as many living characters in my book. And so for me, the responsibility feels almost kind of self-inflicted, I think, because of my father's genealogical bent, because for him it was almost a spiritual practice, even though I think he consciously might have resisted that. So the way that memory works, kind of psychologically or neurologically, is every time you go back and revisit a memory, you change it in some way, right? Even just within your own mind. And so then there's certainly an aspect of that, putting it on the page. And the thing that's been so interesting about setting this book out into the world is that I also, even though this isn't my first book, I wrote it deciding, because it felt like I was casting spells and telling fortunes, I wrote it with this energy charge where I thought, this is just going to be a Word file on my computer. I'm going to get it out of my system and then we'll see what comes next. And I finished it on March 14th, or maybe even the morning of the 15th, and submitted it to the National Poetry Series. It's the first place that I submitted it. And, my other work took quite a while to get picked up. And this, it was like, whoops, I barely even had time to figure out what I had made. And now it's out in the world. And books have this way. I mean, I don't have children, but it seems similar to my friends with kids, where you realize, oh, you're an independent being and you're going to take on a life of your own and do what you will. And people are going to have their own relationships with you that are separate from me. And so I think that's the piece around memory that's been really interesting, especially in putting down in words some version of stories that now dead people told me about other dead people. It feels like casting a spell, and I hope ultimately the energy that we've conjured tonight and in general with our books is positive. But yeah, it's heavy. And I think the last thing that I'll say is not about memory, but it's just about this amazing bookstore and the events that you're doing. I hope that everyone out there will show Left Bank some love. I am a very committed hermit, and at first lockdown seemed great. And then I realized, oh my goodness, even I need community. And so the fact that there are independent bookstores out there building that community is so hugely valuable. And there are other places that sell books and they don't do this. So I really encourage everyone to buy your books from the places that make the magic, and Left Bank's one of those places. So I feel super honored to have been in conversation with Devin. I mean, I just admire your work so much. I feel like we could talk for 4 more hours. I hope we get to do that in the future. But
we'll
just
make it happen.
Grateful, definitely.
I feel so grateful to have read your book too. I got it and I immediately read it twice. I read it in one sitting, and then I was like, wow, I couldn't put it down. And then I was like, okay, now I need to do the slower read and let myself underline and have time to underline things. And but I like read it twice in the same day, and I love all of the kind of call and responses, the echoes that I was able to identify by reading it that way. I was like, this is such a tightly woven, to use your metaphor, but such a tightly woven collection. And maybe like, I wonder if part of that comes out of the fact that you did like write it in this one kind of, you wrote it fairly quickly, right?
Yeah, less than a year.
So there's a kind of continuity that comes in when you're writing something and you're in a given space and time too. I would love to ask you more about like your editing process, because I just thought this was such a beautifully, perfectly edited book too, but it seems we might be out of time.
Well, thank you for the kind words. It really means a lot. This is an amazing book. I hope people will consider getting the first 25 of you to the gate, get a signed book plate from Left Bank. So I hope you'll take advantage of that.
Look at these woods. You want to wander through them. Believe me.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Teresa, your kind words about independent bookstores. I know that booksellers across the country and independent bookstores, those words and that support from authors and from customers just means the world right now. And we are so grateful to host you both and to be able to put on events like these. So I just want to say thank you to you both. Thank you to the audience for watching. And yes, buy both of their collections from Left Bank Books. You can get signed copies in store or online. And with that, we will say good night to all. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Much.